We called Dean up here to give a little background. So Dean is a civic scholar in the School of Arts and Sciences at Southern New Hampshire University, the founder of his own political blog, NewHampshirePoliticalCapital.com. His focus is presidential politics and policy, campaigns and elections, and New Hampshire politics and its presidential primary. He is the author of a book, Vicious Cycle, Presidential Decision Making in the American Political Economy, and has published research in a variety of professional journals, including American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and Presidential Studies Quarterly. So, Dean, if you wanted to give a few remarks, your thoughts.
Let people watch the end of the
Yeah.
movie, or watch the pictures while I set up?
Sure. Yeah.
And then I'll use this.
Okay.
Seriously, I didn't think I would.
Okay. Everyone hear me okay? This sounds like it's pretty good.
Yeah.
I hope you... Make sure I don't... We on? Uh-oh. Check? Check? Good? Okay, I don't want to talk too loudly. This sounds pretty good. Thank you all for sticking around. The goal here is I'm going to have just a few remarks reacting to the movie and Obama's legacy, and then we'll open it up for questions, and hopefully I'm interested to hear what you all have to say. As Tim mentioned, the World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan organization. My goal here tonight is not to really take one side or the other, but I have to note it was interesting listening to many of you groan and moan when they showed the election night on MSNBC. So I think for some of you it was reliving a little bit of a tough night, and we'll talk about that. So Tim asked me to speak a little bit on President Obama's foreign policy legacy. I get asked to do these kinds of assessments occasionally, and what I really like to do is just to sit down and think a little bit about the topic, in this case Obama's foreign policy, and think about, what are the first couple of things that pop into my mind. I'm going to switch my glasses here. I don't like looking at blurry people, but my progressives aren't quite as progressive as they used to be, so I'm sort of stuck in between, but much better. So what I usually like to do is just kind of sit with a pad and think about the topic and jot down the first things that come to mind. And I'm sure if I talked with each of you individually and asked you to assess President Obama's legacy or high points or low points, you could all probably pretty quickly give me a list of 2 or 3 issues or moments that stand out for you. And so I'd like to do that without any kind of internet interference, so I always resist the temptation to Google something like Obama's foreign policy legacy ? And read what other people have to say, because I don't want it to influence my reactions or my thoughts on the issue. And that's essentially what I did here. I had not seen this movie before. As I told Tim, I had planned to come and see it when I saw it listed, and I was quite pleased when he asked me to piggyback on the end of the movie with some comments. And having gone through this exercise and sort of jotting down my thoughts and seeing if they feel complete to me, and then watching this movie, I'm pretty happy with what I have here on the paper in front of me. I feel like I was able to sort of come up with, I think, some comments and some thoughts about his legacy. And it is a real challenge to determine President Obama's legacy. And I think part of the problem is that so much of his legacy, and even that of the presidents before him, President Bush, President Clinton on back, is really now being defined in reaction to what President Trump is doing. And it was interesting, I looked at the movie and I sort of clocked when was the first mention of President Trump, and you saw Melania and then President Trump up on the flat screens about 45 minutes into the movie. And I think part of the challenge for defining Obama's legacy now is that so much of what Trump is doing in a sort of a decisive, almost reflexive way is trying to undo Obama's legacy, really. You can see at the end of the movie, Samantha Power, Ben Rhodes, they all started talking about the long haul, the long fight, and the idea that now, clearly much of what they had done, or some of it was going to be undone, or at least partially undone, and that this was going to be a longer horizon event for them. And Trump's approach is so different from Obama or Bush or Clinton that I'm finding in talking to people about foreign policy and where we were and where we're headed, that Trump is so different that Obama, Clinton, Bush, they're all kind of blending together. There's more continuity almost among the three of them than what we're seeing now with President Trump. So I think that poses a little bit of a challenge for figuring out what his foreign policy legacy might be. In the end, my guess is that Obama's foreign policy legacy, it's going to be mixed. It's such a complex policy domain that I think it's the same for most presidents. Most presidents have some big successes, they have some big failures. If they're lucky, they're in there for 8 years, so you're going to have some real highs and lows. Still, I think if we look for a doctrine or a defining moment, Obama clearly embraces, and we heard it here from him and others, kind of a global perspective in the transmission of American democratic values and ideas. And in the end, I think this is interesting, I think his fidelity to diplomatic institutions and processes, that is going to be his legacy. We've seen that these institutions and processes, like the State Department, like the UN, they've started to wither a little bit under the Trump administration, particularly the State Department. And we've also seen the concept of kind of a multilateral global approach to negotiations decline as well. Trump clearly, and I don't think this is out of bounds to say, clearly has a bit of an authoritarian streak. He has a penchant for kind of a strongman view of the world. And here I literally mean strongman. I've noted on a number of occasions he seems very uncomfortable dealing with Theresa May of Great Britain, Angela Merkel of Germany. He really prefers a sort of great man or a strongman notion of history in which these individual relationships between him and other big players are really going to define the future of foreign policy around the globe. So he literally focuses on these individuals, as Trump, on these individual relationships with Putin, Russia, Duterte of the Philippines, maybe even Kim Jong-un, eventually with North Korea. He has said he prefers this kind of bilateral interaction. And you've noted in the movie there is a lot of bilateral negotiation that goes on at kind of a granular level, but Obama's larger approach was always about bringing in working in conjunction with other countries at the same time, our allies, different parts of the world, and trying to come up with sort of a larger notion of how different countries in the globe, different regions in the world should interact. And so now we're dealing with a very different notion of foreign policy, and it is, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's a pretty significant departure from all that came before it, which is why there often seems like there's more continuity, as I mentioned, in some of the previous administrations than between any prior administration and President Trump. So we've heard this time and again, the idea that the foreign policy, diplomacy, international relations, that we have these long-standing institutions, the United Nations, maybe treaty organizations like NATO, certainly the State Department, that these are kind of core institutions with processes that have been in place for many years that allow nations to interact. And that presidents generally have used these processes and these institutions to move our foreign policy forward. And this seems to be something that Trump has been less interested in doing, and I think that's a sort of a big difference between him and President Obama. So, say a little bit about some high points and some low points in the Obama administration. I was kind of tracking and watching the movie, trying to track a little bit with what I have here and kind of what they mention as their big moments on the list. So some of the high points for the Obama administration, I'm going to be interested to hear kind of what you have to say as well. First, obviously, most people mention successful elimination of Osama bin Laden, something that presidents have been trying to do for a number of years. He was successful in doing that. That is something that he's gotten universal credit for. The progress on climate change, you can think of the Paris Accord that was mentioned in the movie. Again, there's an example of where Obama foreign policy was much more comfortable working with multiple countries to come up with a larger agreement. Trump clearly is undoing that right now. We'll see if that changes in the future. You saw both John Kerry and President Obama mentioning progress on climate change as being very important. So certainly his legacy was an attempt to make this a more central uniting issue in global relationships. The Iran agreement, which as we now know, Trump is also going to pull out of. Another example of multilateral negotiations involving a lot of different countries. It's funny, I remember when President Obama was first running for president in 2008, and there was a debate, and one of the questions was about Iran, and he mentioned how he would be willing to meet with leaders in Iran, and he was roundly criticized for even suggesting that. And we've certainly come a long way from that. And there have been arguments about whether or not this was a good agreement and whether it really would accomplish a denuclearization of Iran. But the general feeling was that this was probably sort of the best agreement that could be hoped for under the circumstances. As I said, Trump is now pulling out of that. More generally, a close relationship with most of our key allies. You think about how closely he worked with Germany and France, and certainly, of course, Great Britain. It got a little bit rough with Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel towards the end of his time in office. Trump has established a much closer relationship, obviously, with Mr. Netanyahu. So those are some of the kind of high points that I think of. It's interesting, Ben Rose was kind of focused on Cuba. That didn't pop into my head. I thought that was something I think people thought was potentially very promising. It's now kind of dialed back a little bit. We had that episode with a number of our diplomats having some sort of hearing issue, or they literally did some damage to their hearing, and so that's a little bit more unclear about where that's going to head. And Trump seems a lot less interested in fleshing out that relationship further. So in terms of the high points and kind of the upside of the legacy, again, it's this idea of a reliance and a fidelity on the institutions and processes of diplomacy, the State Department, United Nations, our allies, NATO. We think about President Trump, he's been very critical of all of those. State Department, very critical of NATO, other countries not paying their own way. Very critical of the United Nations. Republicans for a long time felt that it's in some respects, a waste of American dollars. So Obama, obviously a very different perspective. Low points. Well, there are certainly some you can point to. I think in the end, as I mentioned, most presidents, you end up with kind of a mixed bag here. The red line in Syria, you remember President Obama drew the red line, the sort of metaphorical red line in Syria, which Assad crossed, and the feeling was that he missed an opportunity to respond there. Syria is a very difficult example of a foreign policy crisis, really. I've talked to some of you who follow electoral politics. I've talked to presidential candidates. I've talked to members of Congress from both parties. And nobody seems to have, and I really have any good idea of what to do there. I just had a conversation last week with a Democratic senator from Oregon, Jeff Merkley was in the state, and asked him about Syria, and he just kept saying how complicated it was. And I think that's the feeling on both sides. I'm not sure that anybody has an answer to that, particularly now as Russia and Iran get increasingly comfortable operating in the area. But certainly, Syria was a rough spot for President Obama. Probably one of the first things that jumped into my mind in terms of a sort of a negative, the chaos surrounding the Arab Spring in places like Egypt and Libya and elsewhere. You know, there's always been this belief among Americans, certainly pre-Trump, before this kind of more isolationist turn, George W. Bush as well, that we can take our democratic values, democracy, etc., and spread it to the rest of the world, democratization. And when you democratize some of these countries, you get all kinds of unintended consequences. You may end up with a theocracy or an authoritarian ruler. We've seen the kind of global move towards nationalism in a lot of these countries. And so just a general sense that the administration kind of was sort of behind this concept of an Arab Spring, and then when things got kind of chaotic, we sort of backed away a little bit. And I think that's an area where I think they probably didn't accomplish all that they would have accomplished. Obviously, and you certainly can't pin this on President Obama alone because he inherited this from the previous administration, Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been in those places now for almost 2 decades. We're closing in on 2 decades. As you saw in the movie, I was, again, sort of timing on my watch how long it would take for them to mention Iraq and Afghanistan. It was an hour into the movie, and it was really just kind of a brief mention of the sacrifice that our soldiers have made and how difficult a situation it is. But